Welcome back. Glad that you're all here again. For this video, I want to talk about introduction paragraphs. Whenever I ask students about the hardest parts of an essay or the parts of an essay that they don't like the most, two of the biggest answers I'll get are introductions and conclusions. Excuse me. And I think there's a pretty good reason for this. I think it's because a lot of the advice that we're given, especially in high school, about introductions and conclusions is just very bad, very wrong, I think. So I'm going to try to give some better advice. I don't think it's going to make it easy. I don't think it's going to make you love writing introductions, but hopefully we can at least change our perspective a little bit, and maybe we'll at least have a better sense of like what we're trying to accomplish, and maybe that'll make it easier to do and hopefully more effective. So I usually ask students, what do you remember being told about how to write introductions? And students, they might remember some stuff. Some people don't remember anything. One thing that somebody will always remember is that an introduction is supposed to have a hook. If you're not familiar with this idea, if you haven't heard it before, the hook is this idea that the first sentence of your essay has to be like this interesting thing that's gonna hook the reader in and like make them want to continue reading and make them want to learn more about what you're saying. Some of the things that you might have heard to do for a hook are like ask a rhetorical question, or use a quote. And I don't know. I just don't really like this idea of a hook. They would tell you like start it off by being like, Webster's dictionary defines justice as, or something like that, or give like a quote from Abraham Lincoln or something. And I really am just like against this idea of a hook. I think that it doesn't make it just doesn't make sense to me fundamentally. And I think one of the reasons that we hate introductions, and that they've been hard for us is that I think we just kind of instinctually know that specifically this idea of a hook is very stupid. It's silly, and I'm not blaming you guys because that's what they told you to do. I had to do that stuff too when I was going through school. But I think once we get to college writing, yeah, we can kind of lift a lot of these rules and restrictions, because I've said this before, but I feel like a lot of the stuff they told you about writing in the past was more about checking boxes and following rules than it was about actually writing a good essay or actually convincing your reader or any of that stuff. So the idea of a hook, that the first sentence is supposed to be this interesting thing that makes the reader want to keep reading. What kind of reader reads the first sentence of something, of an essay that's maybe, 3 pages, 4 pages, 5 pages, maybe longer than that? What kind of reader reads the first sentence and is like, nope, that's not interesting enough for me, oh, well, that's, that's, well, your first sentence wasn't good enough, like, I'm out. That wasn't interesting enough. When you guys read things, is that the approach that you take? I know you guys might not read academic essays, but if you read an essay about sports, or if you read an article about the news or something, or some kind of article about COVID or whatever, if you any kind of article that you're like gonna read on the internet for whatever reason, do you ever read the first sentence and go, nope, that wasn't interesting enough, I'm not reading it? It's just this very strange thing, and it's a really hostile imagining of the reader, where they're judging you so hard. This isn't interesting enough for me. I need to be entertained. It's like, entertain me, clown. You didn't entertain me enough, so it's not interesting enough. I'm not reading it. It's insane. It's like a psychotic thing, I think, of way of imagining the reader. I don't think real readers are like that. I think the only reader who's ever been like that is a teacher who was more concerned with marking up your paper with red ink than they were about actually understanding what you tried to say, or evaluating if your argument was like convincing or if your evidence was good, and that kind of stuff. So like for me, if someone's gonna read my essay looking for the first sentence, and if it's not good enough, they're out. Like if that's your approach to reading my essay, like you can fuck off. Like I don't need that person as a reader. If that's your approach, like go read something else then. And honestly, I don't know if you're ever gonna find something where the first sentence is interesting enough. The other thing to me is like, is giving a quote from Abraham Lincoln really interesting? Is that really engaging to the reader? Like, oh wow, I need to keep reading this. You gave me the definition of justice from the dictionary. Now I'm gonna keep reading this. And I remember too with the idea of asking a question. I think can work sometimes. I won't dismiss that one as much as the other things they told you about doing a hook. I think there can be a good way of starting with a question, but it's got to be a real question. You know, it's got to be a legitimate question that you actually want the reader to think more about. That'll like lead them into your argument in some way. Like maybe the worst version I've ever seen of someone like starting with a question goes to I don't know if I've mentioned in these videos yet that I used to do tutoring. I used to have a tutoring job where I did like tutoring for the SAT, but I would also work with like younger kids, as young as like second grade, and I had to work with this little girl who was in second grade, and the tutoring place had her write an essay about like her favorite color. You know, the whole essay was about red is her favorite color and why it's her favorite and all that. So she starts it, the first sentence, the hook, right? The first sentence is, "Do you have a favorite color?" And that to me, it's a false question. You know, you don't actually care what the reader's answer to that is. It's not meant to make them think about anything in a different way than they had before, or to kind of expand like their knowledge in any sort of way. It's just asking a question for the sake of asking a question because they told this little girl you have to ask a question. So that's how we get to her asking, "Do you have a favorite color?" Um, so, and again, I'm not blaming you guys for doing this. It's what they told us to do. What else were we gonna do? We're trying to get a good grade, right? But I'm out on this idea of a hook. I don't need it. I'm very against it. But what do we do instead becomes the question. And I'm afraid I don't have any super easy answers here. One thing that I think you can do, one kind of framing that I think can work for the first sentence is like to start off by being, and it doesn't have to be this formulaic. Again, I'm not trying to give you more rules or anything, but just something that sort of makes sense to me is starting it off by being like, a lot of people think this, but actually I think this is the case. And I think something like that can work because it kind of gives a reason for why you're going to write your essay, if you're trying to correct some common thing that people get wrong all the time, I can see that as kind of a decent way of starting. But more important than that, I think my kind of overall advice for an introduction paragraph, and I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about the narrative essay that we're doing specifically, which is a little bit different. But just for like a standard college essay, for an argument essay, the kind of approach that I would take to an introduction is to start off more generally, just kind of about your topic, and then get to your specific argument by the end of the introduction. So if we're writing about language for this class, maybe you have a few sentences at the beginning about like how language works, and language can be more important than you thought, and actually language can connect us to our culture, or actually people get treated unfairly because of the kind of language that they use. If they don't speak standard English, they're told that they're unprofessional and not smart, and that sort of stuff. So you could start with something more general, and then you would want to be like, and now I'm going to tell you a story that shows that, language connects us to our culture and our tradition, and then you can get into your story or whatever. But you want to start kind of more generally with the topic, whatever the topic is. Maybe you're writing about, I don't know, pollution or something. You could be like, pollution, it's a big problem. Here's how much pollution comes out of cars or something. Here's how much plastics in the ocean, whatever it is. And then get to your specific thing, like, we need to make these changes to make pollution better. The other thing that they might have told you about an introduction, and I sort of agree with this, is that you're supposed to have your thesis in your introduction. I had my other video on doing a thesis, right? So you already know that for me, a thesis, it's not a thesis statement. It doesn't have to be just one sentence. It can be more than one sentence. It doesn't have to have the three things, I believe this for this reason and this reason and this reason. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be a few sentences. The main thing, though, is that once the reader's finished with your introduction, you want them to know what your argument is going to be. You want them to know what you're going to be trying to convince them of in this essay. Yeah, so that is something that we want to have, and so the thesis, it doesn't have to be the last sentence or anything, but you just want to make sure by the end of that paragraph the reader knows, okay, here's what they're going to try to convince me of throughout the rest of the essay. So in a way, you're sort of like previewing your argument. So that is something that you want to do. Another thing I'll say about writing introduction paragraphs, it does not have to be the first thing that you write. I feel like one of the reasons that students get writer's block, which is obviously the worst, right? Something we want to avoid. Well, I think one of the big reasons students get writer's block is because they're looking at, a blank page, a blank Word document, and they're like, okay, now I have to write a hook. The first thing that I write has to be the first sentence. Oh my God, there's so much pressure on it. I think that's another problem with the hook, with the idea of the hook, is that it puts so much pressure on the first thing that you're like, oh my God, it's got to be so interesting. Don't worry about it too much. Not such a big deal. I'm much more concerned with your argument and your evidence and the organization of your paragraphs and all that kind of stuff. The introduction does not have to be the first thing that you write. I think a lot of us do it that way because so many of the essays that we've written have been like timed essays in class. At least it was for me in through high school and stuff, where they give you 40 minutes to write an essay and you have to write it with a pencil and paper. And that kind of forces you to write the introduction first, because what are you going to do? You don't know how much space you need. You kind of have to start there. But for our essays, where we're obviously typing them, and we're going to write them over a period of a few weeks, you don't have to write the introduction first. Start with something you know is going to be in there. So maybe you start with like the third paragraph because you know what you want to say there. So just start typing that up. And then you can always go back and write the introduction. So don't feel like you have to write the introduction first. In fact, sometimes I think it's easier to not write the introduction first. Because if the introduction is supposed to preview your argument, you kind of have to have a good idea of what your argument is. And at the beginning of the writing process, we don't always necessarily have that. Sometimes when we start writing, we kind of figure out what we want to say. The experience of writing some of the paragraphs can sometimes make us realize, like, oh, wait a minute, this is what my essay is really about. And that's okay, that happens, that's part of the process. But then at that point, it might then be easier, once you've kind of figured that out, to then go back and do the introduction, right? So don't feel like it has to be the first thing that you write. Okay, now I want to say a couple of things specifically about the narrative essay. So everything I just said was kind of just more generally for any essay you have to write in college. Now I want to talk specifically about this narrative essay. So I think there's kind of two approaches that you can take to doing the introduction for this essay. One of them is the standard approach that we just talked about. To start off, just talking about language or something, and then, tell us why how your story is going to show us that language is important, whether it's, one of those 4 topics on the assignment sheet, unfair treatment, culture, talking back, word choice. You want to let us know which one of those 4 topics you're going to be going with in your introduction if you're doing it this way. And then you can kind of be like, okay, and now I'm going to tell you a story. You don't have to say it this way, right? But you can kind of lead up to it and be like, all right, now I'm going to tell a story that kind of proves this point about language that I'm telling you about in my introduction. That's one option. The other thing that you can do is just kind of start in the middle of the story, and then kind of get back to the thing about language maybe a little bit later on. And this is only for a narrative essay. It's only because this is a weird kind of essay that, has us telling a story, and it's there's kind of like some different things that apply to it. So one thing you can do is just start with the action. You can be like, okay, my alarm clock, my alarm clock rang, and I woke up and it was 9 a.m. and I got out of bed and had to go to school. Whatever it is, however you want to start the story that you're telling, you can have your introduction just kind of throw us right into the action. And then in a later paragraph, you just want to make sure that you get to like, oh, and now I'm realizing how language connects us to our culture, or how people get treated unfairly because of their language. You want to make sure that you get to that message, But I think it can work if you want your introduction just to be kind of the beginning of the story, And then at some other point, you kind of get to like, okay, and here's the thing about language. Make sure that you have that, right? Because, one of the things I've been telling you, we need to make sure that our narrative essay has a clear message about language. We want to make sure that the reader knows, like, hey, this was the point of the story. Like, I know I gave you a lot of details and a lot of dialogue, and I told it from the first person and all that. But here's the main thing you were supposed to be getting out of this. It's about language. It might be more important than you think, all that stuff. So those are kind of the two options. A standard introduction where you just set up the general topic of language and then get into your story, or just kind of starting in the middle of the story and then like setting up the thing about language a little bit later. All right, so again, I know this doesn't make writing introductions fun or easy. They're probably still annoying. We're probably still not going to like them. But I hope by shifting our perspective, and realizing that, the hook, whatever, that we're more just trying to set up what's going to come later. We're more trying to just let the audience know, like, okay, here's the argument that I'm about to make. And then in the paragraphs, you give all of your evidence and you really try to convince them of that argument. I think that's kind of my best advice. I know it doesn't make it super simple. One of the things that a lot of the stuff I say about writing does is like it gives you more freedom, you know? There's less rules, it's less rigid, it's less like, oh no, you didn't do it the way that the rule says, so you get points off. It's less like that, but it gives you more freedom, which I think is good, but that can also be overwhelming, you know? It can also be like, well, what am I gonna do? So that's a thing that we're gonna have to try to work through all semester with a lot of this stuff. All right, but that's my best advice on introductions. I'll talk to you soon.